hasn't quite set in that we own a 500 horsepower V10 estate car. That badge on the back, that startup sound in the morning, it's pretty special. But before this car gets settled in, we've headed up north to check out and sort out everything that could possibly go wrong on these pretty scary cars. But I think, judging by the name above the door, we're in the right place. So Steve, are you Mr Vanos himself?
I am Mr Vanos, yes.
Right, and we're bringing this car back up here, and I say back up here because you were the last owner of this car, so you must know it top to bottom.
Yeah, we generally don't buy a car unless we go through the car before we look, before we actually make the purchase. So we've gone over it from inside out, top to bottom, decided it was a good car, it's a clean car, it's a nice example of a V10 Tourer.
When we said on the channel we were going to buy a V10 BMW, my Instagram DMs were inundated with very kind people telling me everything that can possibly go wrong with this pretty fragile engine. So I just want to check them off. The first one, of course, is the rod bearings, throttle actuators, fuel injectors, Vanos pump. Is that about right?
Pretty much, yeah. The Vanos pump is kind of a myth to some degree. There's issues or failures with them and bearing failure, but I've never personally seen it in 14 years. So
okay.
I do know they go wrong.
And what's great about this car is, am I right in saying pretty much all of those jobs have been done recently apart from the rod bearings?
Yeah, rod bearings is the last thing to do. We did the throttle actuators when they bought the car because it had a fault with the throttle, so we basically put our own rebuilt units on. Yeah, rod bearings is pretty much the last thing to sort of go through, and that's that. But generally speaking, other than that, the car's a good one, yeah.
Great, okay. Well, rod bearings first. Is that up on the ramp and sump off?
Up on the ramp, sump off, subframe out. Yeah, that's the first thing to do.
Okay, let's do it. To show you guys the worst case scenario when it comes to rod bearings, these are off of an E92 M3, and apparently these are one hard drive away from slipping and complete KO for the engine. Now, all performance cars will have an Achilles heel, and it just so happens on the S65 and S85 BMWs, it is these little things here. But something that massively helps owning and running a performance car is having sponsors on board. So thankfully, today's video is sponsored by our friends at Car Vertical. And you guys may have seen in our reveal video for the M5, Car Vertical dug up some pretty serious dirt from this vehicle's past. Using information taken from many different databases across the globe, the entire history of the car ends up in a nice, neat report for you to look over before buying it. If it has been in an accident, written off, stolen, or has outstanding finance on it, this report will tell you. It is super easy to use, just create an account and then punch in the registration of the car you want to check, and in a jiffy, you'll have a full report to scour over to make sure you aren't buying a troublesome car. So if you think this service would come in handy as you journey through the second-hand car market, get 10% off by clicking the link in the description below. This is what the report for our M5 looks like, and the main thing, the main red flag, is damage caused to the car back in 2018. Now, that was due to a small fire, but thankfully that was completely fixed to get the car back on the road, which is why today's video is about fixing everything else. So Steve, what are you expecting to see when we see these bearings?
There's quite a common pattern of wear with the bearings on these cars. It's usually to do on the upper half of the bearing that lives in the upper half of the rod, because that's the one that gets all of the compression, all of the load against it.
Yep.
You usually see uneven wear patterns on the top of the bearing, mainly in the sort of central 50–60%. So.
And I've seen pictures on the internet. If we get down to copper, is that the danger zone,
Yes,
basically?
copper is the final layer, which is the soft part that does all the embeddability and stuff with the shell. So it's the protection of the backing plate.
Okay.
So once you go through the copper, you're onto the backing plate, and that's it.
Right, so what are we looking for here? That looks pretty good.
This is the lower half bearing.
Okay.
So the lower half is generally a lot better, but there is some contact points in the middle there. That doesn't look bad at all.
The tension. Okay,
So they're not too bad.
so it's still silvery.
There is a point of contact in the middle where it's been dry, or it's had contact with the crank. So, yeah, by far not the worst I've ever seen, by a long, long way.
Okay, so the whole problem with these is just sheer lack of lubrication. Is that it?
Yeah.
The oil pump or the lubrication channels were simply not enough from stock to stop this from happening.
It's not so much the oil capacity of the engine. The pump has got huge capacity, it will provide enough oil. It's not enough clearance between the crank journal and the bearing itself. For some unknown reason, they decided to make the clearance around half of what is acceptable for a high revving, high RPM engine.
Okay.
So combine that with 1060 oil, not enough clearance. The bearings were destined to fail from the day this engine was assembled.
Looking at these bearings here then, how long until this would definitely need changed?
That's got quite a while.
Right, okay.
It has got quite a while.
We're
But
talking years.
yeah, thousands of miles, yeah.
Okay, so let's say worst case scenario. You've got lack of lubrication
Yep.
and then everyone talks about them spinning. What exactly happens there?
It's easier to show with the cap half, but that is fairly well into that. It's quite tight and it fits in, and the shape of the bearing is slightly, I won't say oval, but it's eccentric, it's not round.
So it's just a press fit?
It press fits in
Right.
there, and the two halves of the bearing go on top of each other, and as the rod goes together, the two halves of the bearing crush against each other, and the crush is what keeps the bearing in place in the journal. So when eventually there's a lack of oil, the bearing touches and touches and touches the crank. Eventually one touch is all it takes, and it just grabs hold of the bearing and picks it and rotates it round in the housing of the rod. And that's where the damage comes from. And it's basically game over. It's a new crankshaft and replace the rod because the rod's out of round.
And you showed me an engine just around the corner there where one of these has basically welded itself to the crank.
Yes.
So is that just lack of lubrication and then got so hot
Yeah.
that it's just
It just
welded
essentially,
in place?
it bonds itself with the heat, and then it's game over.
Okay, well it's good to know that these look okay, but I guess just whack the rest out
Yeah,
and see what they look like.
see what it look like, yeah. Yep.
Cool. So one of the big debates online seems to be which rod bearings you put back in.
Yes.
And these ones are not what came standard with the car. So what are these ones here?
We use ACL race bearings.
Okay.
We were the first ones in the country to use it when they were introduced. So when they brought these out, it was a good alternative to the factory ones, which even the newer style bearings still come with not enough oil clearance. They have a better bearing crush between the two halves, which means that they've got more of a lock inside the rod itself. So it's got a tighter fit, which again resists spinning if there is any contact. They've got a sacrificial layer on the top, which is that silvery brown appearance. That's a layer that gets polished off as the engine starts and the engine runs. It just basically micro polishes the crank. So it takes any really small imperfections out there to give it a perfect film surface.
Okay, well, let's get the first ones in. So that's all 10 cylinders now sorted in terms of rod bearings, but being Mr Vanos, you've noticed something with the Vanos pump before we put the oil pump on. So what is wrong with this?
Yes, so we generally do it with all the cars, just in case they've been off in the past, the pump's been replaced or the high pressure line that runs from here to the top of the engine's been replaced, is to check the mesh between that gear and the gear that's on the end of the crankshaft.
Okay.
It's like a crown wheel and pinion effect in a diff, where they have to set the mesh properly. There's a certain tolerance, and outside of that tolerance, if it's too big, it's really noisy. If it's too tight, which is, I think, the side that's probably more detrimental to the pump, if it's too tight, it puts stress on the bearings, and that probably is the cause of a Vanos pump failure that we haven't seen, but plenty of people have seen it around. So at the minute, what we have is 0.03 of a millimetre of tolerance when turning the gear backwards and forwards by hand. The tolerance is 0.06 to 0.8, so it's less than half of what it should be.
Okay, so it's far too tight.
Far too tight, yeah. So the best thing to do is, while we're in here, do it properly, set it to the factory spec, and we know that we're not going to have a problem down the line with the bearing failure in the pump.
Okay, well, let's sort this out. With the sump back on the V10, it was a good time to sort out another small job that needs done on the car before lowering it down, the front lower control arms. So Steve, another one of the big debates I've seen online is the oil that goes into the car. So BMW started with one compound of oil and people are saying use a very different one. What's the case here?
We are using a different oil to BMW recommend.
Okay.
The factory recommendation was a 1060 oil. We're using a 1050 oil, classed as a race oil.
Okay, so it's thinner oil, which means especially at startup, basically everything gets lubricated better. Is that the case?
Yeah, it's a little bit thinner, mainly when it's hot, but the benefits of that is that it flows faster.
Yep.
It gets around the engine quicker, which then draws the heat away from the components faster as it flows. It clings a lot better due to the type of oil it is. It sticks to metal better, and that means that on cold start it's actually sat in place as it should be rather than draining away.
Okay, and then with this V10, the story is just more and more. Everything is more. So there's more oil going into it, but also you need to change it way more often.
Yeah. The reason we say change it more often, there's so much oil in this engine from the factory. It's around about 15 litres of oil goes in from a fresh build when we build them.
Yeah.
Oil cooler's big, the pipe work, it's a semi-dry sump. On an oil change in a dealership or as we do them, an oil and filter change is approximately 9.5 litres.
Okay. And what is regularly? How often should I be changing the oil in this?
We recommend every 5,000 to 7,000 miles depending on use. So if you're using it as a daily driver every single day, you could probably go to 7,000 or once a year.
And that's another issue. Not only did BMW put what was basically the wrong oil in it, but also they want you to hang on to it for much longer. What's their service schedule versus what you're saying?
They're saying 19,000 miles.
19, so basically four
Yes.
times the length
Yeah.
on the same oil.
That's what we recommend, yeah. So realistically, that is one of the biggest causes of the bearing failure, as much as the clearance, the oil usage and the type of oil and how long it's changed. So.
Okay, so I think that's everything sorted now. Are we good for a startup?
We are good, yeah. If you want to jump in it, we'll get a tune out of it.
My pleasure.
Hear it change.
Yeah, the slip change there.
That's pretty much it.
Happy with that?
Yeah. So the crankshaft centre's now plugged back in. You're good to start the car now.
Okay, let's go.
That's it. We're good.
So the engine is warming up nicely behind us. So I just want to go through the checklist in my head of all the issues.
Yes.
So done the rod bearings. We had to check on the Vanos pump, but that's all good now. We can actually hear it ticking behind us.
Yes, yep.
The next thing was the injectors, but you've done them very recently, haven't you?
Yes, one of the first things I did when we got the car was to change the fuel injectors. Reason being, so paranoid about them sticking open and failing, it's catastrophic and it basically can destroy the block.
That means the final thing is the throttle actuator.
Yes.
So we've actually got two here, and these two came off of this car.
They did, yes, yeah.
Okay, so when did you do this job? Is this fairly recent?
This was done in January.
Okay, so what makes these so trick and what goes wrong with them?
What makes them trick is the reaction time. They're really fast, they can react very quickly. So BMW were looking for something that could open the throttle as fast as they wanted the engine to rev.
Yeah.
So these can do that. The issue is they live inside the V, and it's a hot engine at the best of times.
Sure.
So they were destined to fail at some point. There isn't really any replaceable or serviceable parts from BMW, but there are now companies that are rebuilding them and offering lifetime warranties on them. The main issue with them is, if you look at that one where it's sat,
Yep.
and you operate that freely, it will turn and drop back to its position.
Yep.
The main issue is that these tend to stick in a certain point. And what that is, inside of here, there's a plastic gear, and the plastic gear wears.
So is that one basically stuck at 20% throttle?
Round about that point, yeah. It's basically, it's not returning fully,
Yep.
and it's sticking.
So that's every major engine job finished on this car then?
It is, yes, yeah.
Okay, cool. So that means the only thing left, I remember you said you wanted to do the brakes on it all round.
Yeah, just some pads are probably long overdue. So I think that's the final thing, and that's the car sorted then for you. So.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve.
No problem.
It has been eye-opening getting my hands dirty with this car today. Having been only used to working on Fords and Rovers up until now, it's been pretty incredible seeing how much more complicated a car of this caliber becomes. I guess it all comes down to simply the increase in power. More power means more heat, which means you need more heat dissipation, which means you need pretty much more of everything. There's a huge radiator behind there that's split into two to serve each bank of cylinders, and I've seen more heat exchangers on this car than I've seen on any car before, and they're all enormous. And being a V10, it means that there's 10 of a lot of things, if not multiples of 10. 10 cylinders, 20 rod bearing shells, 40 valves, and on top of that, there's 33 sump bolts and 2 sump plugs. And it's not just the power increase, it's also the revs, 8,500 RPM. That's way more than I'm used to, and that means you need that complicated Vanos pump, the trick throttle actuators, and those high pressure fuel injectors. It's an epic piece of road car engineering from a truly legendary era of BMW. So, fingers crossed, we fixed absolutely everything that could go wrong on this car, which means we can crack on with the plans that we have for it, which I cannot wait to share with you guys. A big thank you to Car Vertical for sponsoring today's video, and if you liked it, give it a thumbs up. I've been Mike, and don't forget to subscribe to Drive Tribe.